unexamined assumptions operate powerfully in this arena and actually, in effect, undercut support for broad religious freedom. And it is the unexamined assumptions about proselytism, I think, that our current speakers, or our next speakers, may be able to unpack and perhaps challenge. I'm not going to go into biographical detail. Your programs have biographical information on our speakers. But we have three very distinguished individuals with us. And I'll start with Roger Finke at Penn State University, well-known sociologist of religion who's done very path-breaking quantitative work in the area of religion, society, and government. Roger.
Some topics are so filled with emotion that the vocabulary surrounding the issues are inevitably burdened with excess baggage. And for this reason, several others, I want to be clear that I'm going to use the definition that was recommended by the organizers. And that is that proselytism is the effort to win adherents for one's religious community through persuasion. Now, included in this definition are written and oral communication methods as well as other media. They're intended to persuade others. Excluded from this definition is the use of any form of coercion, like classroom education, showroom sales, or this presentation. Persuasion is the tool of choice. And proselytism is a freedom of speech as well as a freedom of religion. I also want to be clear that persuasion techniques used do not include any mystical powers of brainwashing. Sociologists of religion disagree on many points, but there's a near consensus that not only do religious movements lack the capacity for anything that approximates brainwashing, but they often are not very successful at recruiting either. Social scientists have found that standard models for organizational commitment and social networks have proven quite effective in explaining the high level of commitment in many religious organizations. So what are the consequences of denying proselytism? I want to consider the consequences at two levels. First, I want to look briefly at the consequences for individuals and religious organizations and focus on rights and freedoms at the local level. Second, I want to look at the consequences for the country as a whole and focus more on the practical outcomes for the larger collective. Now, much of my early research looked at the consequences of denying religious freedoms, such as proselytism, for local religious organizations. There are a few very clear findings. First, minority religions face the brunt of restrictions on religious freedoms. From my work on colonial America with Rodney Stark to my more recent work with John Y. Brannick, we have found that minority religions are the first to be denied the right to proselytize. And I should add that the targeting of minority religions is not limited to America. Brian Grimm and I have found that this holds in our cross-national work, and Jonathan Fox's work has provided a strong confirmation of this finding. It's the minority religions who are the targets. A second consistent finding is that even when the right to proselytize is officially granted to individuals and organizations, it is often denied in practice. Even though 83% of the countries with a population of over 2 million offer promises of freedom in their constitutions, 86% of these countries promising such freedoms have at least one law denying religious freedom, and 41% of them have laws restricting or limiting proselytism. Moreover, moving beyond the state, there are often very strong social pressures that try to deny groups their freedoms to proselytize. And this pressure is especially strong for minority religions. This leads to a third consistent finding on religious organizations and religious freedom for individuals, and that is ensuring the right to proselytize relies on protection from the state. In particular, a judiciary that is independent from religious and political authorities has been critical. Historian William McLaughlin explained that during the colonial times in America, the Baptists seldom appealed their cases to the courts because they had no representation on the bench, none at the bar, and seldom any on the juries. The United States now has a strong record of supporting religious freedoms, but even here, minor changes can have significant outcomes. Following the U.S. Supreme Court's controversial ruling on Employment Division of Oregon versus Smith in 1990, John Y. Brannick and I found that minority religions were less likely to take cases to the court and were less likely to receive favorable rulings than before the Smith ruling. Once again, cross-national research strongly supports this same finding. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself, but why should we care? Why should we care about the rights of the minorities? I mean, they're a nuisance anyway. And so do these freedoms provide any benefits for the larger collective? There are a couple of outcomes that I think should interest the collective. First, the religious minorities of one era are often the religious majority of the next. As Bob was pointing out earlier, it's never static. In 1776, only 18% of the religious members were Baptist or Methodist. By 1850, 55% were members of these two denominations. Their growth relied, as far as on the ability to openly proselytize at their camp meetings and revivals, as well as throughout the countryside. And a very sharp difference between in the United States and in Great Britain, where these rights were restricted for the Methodist. Also recall that in the 19th century, Catholics were perceived as a dangerous minority. In 1855, Edward Beecher, the son of Lyman Beecher and brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote a book entitled Papal Conspiracy Exposed and Protestantism Defended. Today, the new immigrant groups and many other new religions rely on these same freedoms. A second selective outcome, or collective outcome, of defending proselytism and other religious freedoms is a far more practical one, and the one I want to give more extensive attention to. And that is, religious freedoms contribute to a more peaceful and civil society. My recent work with Brian Grimm, Jamie Harris, and others clearly demonstrates this. But we were not the first to make the general argument. In the 18th century, many of the most prominent scholars recognized the importance of allowing freedoms for multiple religions. Voltaire wrote, if there were two, they would cut each other's throats, but if there was one, there would be danger of despotism. If there were two, they would cut each other's throats, but there are 30, and they live in peace and happiness. David Hume, and many others, offered similar advice. Adam Smith echoed this thesis, and he explained, quote, if the government was perfectly decided both to let them all alone, they would subdivide themselves fast enough so as soon to become sufficiently numerous. What these scholars often failed to recognize, however, was that it wasn't the plurality of the religions alone that resulted in civility. It was the freedoms that allowed these groups to exist that diffused many of the potential conflicts. Let me offer a couple quick findings to illustrate this. When using data coded from the 2005 International Religious Freedom Reports, Brian Grimm and I found that religiously motivated violence was reported as widespread in 44% of the countries where proselytizing was limited or restricted. But in countries where there were no reported limitations or restrictions on proselytism, only 14% of the countries reported such violence. The differences were even more striking when we looked at social, religious, and cultural pressures against proselytism. 1/2 of the countries with traditional attitudes or clerical edicts discouraging proselytism had high levels of religiously motivated violence, compared to only 16% without such edicts and reported attitudes. Obviously, our research has gone well beyond these basic statistics, but even our complex models, the relationship between denying freedoms and higher levels of persecution and violence remain. It's a very robust relationship. Now, I want to offer a couple, being a true sociologist and also being a sociology theory, I have to offer a couple propositions to help explain this here. First, we know from numerous historical examples, the stronger the alliance between religion and state, the more likely state powers will be used to persecute religious competitors. To state this more formally, to the extent that a religious group achieves a monopoly and holds access to the temporal power and privileges of the state, the ever-present temptation is to openly persecute competitors. Currently, this is most evident in Islamic nations under Sharia law, but the examples go far beyond Islam. Religious freedoms reduce violence and persecution by, and this I really think is the critical part, by offering privileges to all religions and power to none. No single religion can claim the authority of the state. But we also know that even when states are not aligned with a single religion, they often still deny religious freedoms for all or many religions, especially the freedoms of minority religions. This leads to my second proposition, and that is, to the extent that religious freedoms are granted to all religion, the state will have less authority and less incentive to persecute the religion. Having less authority is important because supporting any freedom involving speech can be a nuisance or even a threat. Sometimes states or local governments don't want to hear what the minorities have to say. Religious freedoms also result in fewer incentives, as the multiple religious groups now operating on a level playing field are less of a threat to the state. But the two propositions just stated only address why religious freedoms serve to reduce violence and persecution promoted by the state. These same freedoms also serve to diffuse the religious and social disputes that go beyond the state's actions. Not only do the freedoms reduce the grievances and social isolation of minority religions, they also reduce the ability of other groups to take action against them. For example, the vigilante policing actions of religious and social movements are less tolerated when religious freedoms are protected. Just as state officials often turned a blind eye to the vigilante groups persecuting blacks in the early 20th century in America, groups persecuting religious minorities often face little intervention from the state when religious freedoms go unprotected. And again, that's why I return back to the importance of an independent judiciary. To sum up, supporting the rights of religious minorities and all religions to proselytize can contribute to the freedoms of individuals and the civility of the collective. Even though I disagree with the vast majority of those proselytizing, their freedoms are my freedoms.
Thank you very much for that very crisp presentation. Our next speaker is Robert Woodberry from the University of Texas. Robert.
I agree with Roger that one of the very important things in this debate about religious liberty is the importance of testing our assumptions. A lot of the arguments that are made, even arguments that have been made today, are based on assumptions, most of which have not been tested. And so then people throw around anecdotes about what missionaries do or what particular religious types of people do, etc. But we can always find anecdotes to support our justification, and the more sort of we're partisan to a particular thing, the more we can find them, and if they're not there, we can make them up. The important thing is the average effect of missionaries or whatever, and also not hypocrisy, okay? So if you do missions, you can't critique missions, etc. So I've done a lot of work on trying to measure the effect that missions had. This didn't start out just looking at missionaries, it's looking at sort of democracy and other things in terms of colonialism. But a lot of that involved measuring directly the effect that Protestant and Catholic missionaries had. And that involved doing a history of Protestant and Catholic missionaries in every country of the world, getting data on virtually all Protestant and Catholic missionary activity, education, medical work, etc., from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century, so we can actually measure its effect, and then trying to do all other kinds of controls so we can remove other things related to colonialism and geography and whatever was there before and what happened after. So that way we can actually try and measure the effect that missions had. Also looking historically, what did they do and what did other groups do in terms of response? And I'll make a general argument. I'll say, on average, or most of the time, political and economic and religious elites don't like sharing power. And so when there's competition, they react to it, and sometimes they react to it violently. But when you have monopolies of power or large differences of power, non-elites get neglected. What historically are the circumstances where that distinction between elites and non-elites is interrupted? And one of the major ones over and over again is missions, conversionary activity, religious attempts to convert people. Because people who are being abused inside a given political, economic, and religious system are more likely to defect. And when they do, it forces elites to respond by transferring resources. And you can show this historically and statistically, not only cross-nationally, but also within given countries. So, for example, we tend to think that education is something that everyone should have, or that people should have access to books and printing should be freely available, or that there should be organizations outside state control that people can have. Most people historically didn't think that. Elites everywhere had good education. They didn't educate lots of other people. Elites sometimes had access to books, printing, but they didn't tend to do mass printing. They did it, for the most part, in reaction to Protestant missions. Protestants thought people needed to read the Bible in their own language, which meant they needed to be able to read, which meant they needed to have access to printed texts. If you look at it historically in terms of the spread of printing, Muslim societies, Hindu societies, their Buddhist societies knew how to print for hundreds of years and were repeatedly exposed to the technology and to printed texts, but they did not print. They were introduced by Jews, by Eastern Christians, by Catholic missionaries, and by Western trading companies, the French East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. All of them printed. And most of the vernacular languages of Asia were printed in Europe for hundreds of years. Okay? They printed in response to mass printing by Protestant missionaries trying to convert them with tracts and Bibles, which created a threat and made the incentives for Hindus and Muslims and Theravada Buddhists to print. Mahayana Buddhists printed well before Europe, over 800 years, including have a movable font type more than 80 years before Europe. It never led to newspapers, it never led to mass literacy, it never led to all those consequences that are supposedly caused by printing in Europe. Until in the 19th century, you get Protestant missionaries come doing mass printing, and they start the first newspapers. They create this revolution in terms of printing and access and education. You can look at the same pattern in terms of education for women and the poor, etc. Historically, then you can look at it statistically, and you see the same effect. So, historically, where you had longer prevalence of Protestant missionaries and more Protestant missionaries in the early 20th century, you currently have higher literacy, lower infant mortality, longer life expectancy, higher GDP, more political democracy, etc. Protestant missions alone explains about half of the variation in post-colonial democracy. Half. It removes the effect of most other theories. Okay, almost all of them. I have thrown just about everything you can throw at it, and they don't go away. It's a very, very, very strong effect. Okay? These things were a result of people trying to convert people. They weren't trying to make democracies. Okay? They weren't trying to just transform the class structure. They did that. They had other ends. They had religious ends, and when those ends threatened elites, elites did the same thing because they didn't want them to become Protestant. Okay? And so then you can look in countries with the same religious tradition where they have competition and where they don't. So if you look at Catholic education, in Ireland, the United States, it's great. Some of the very best schools. In Spain, Portugal, Italy, Mexico, a lot of Latin America, it's not as great. Okay? They didn't have competition. If you look at in terms of the provinces or the indigenous communities in Mexico, where there's an article in the American Political Science Review this past fall by a guy named Trejo, and he shows historically that when you start getting conversions to Protestantism, the Catholic Church started to send priests to work among the poor. They started to make communities for organizing indigenous communities for indigenous rights, etc. Now, statistically, we've looked at it, and if you look at, if you control for indigenous communities where this is a significant Protestant community, it totally removes the negative health consequences of being indigenous. Okay, indigenous have worse infant mortality and worse life expectancy on average. But if you control for the Protestant, it removes that effect. They are comparable to non-indigenous communities in Mexico. Okay, so these have very powerful influences, and they help, I would argue, help the Catholic Church be a better church, or help Muslims be a better Muslims, or help Hindus be better Hindus. You look historically in terms of when do you get movements against caste, for example, in India. It's in reaction to getting large-scale mass conversions of Dalits, untouchables, to Christianity. Then you get the concern, oh, better respond. And there's multiple ways you can respond. You can respond through violence and restriction, or you can respond with giving resources etc. And it's not only that not only does it happen outside the West, it happens in the United States. So, for example, historically, Northern missionaries were banned in the South from working with blacks, okay, in the Reconstruction period, because they caused instability, okay? They're creating problems for non-blacks. I mean, for non-blacks, basically. Not for blacks themselves. So we have a lot of ideas about what impact missions has, or the relationship between missions and colonialism, or lots of other things. All of those are empirically testable. We can test them. We can look at them historically. We can look at them statistically. And if we did that, maybe we would get rid of some of the arguments that are used to oppress people.
Thank you very much. As a political scientist, thank you. I just love the fact that we have data, that we're getting data on these issues that have profound normative consequences, and we have these endless normative debates and speculations, and we finally are developing through the very pioneering work of some of the folks on this panel a data foundation for examining these. Our last speaker is Angela Wu, who's the International Director for the Becket Fund, and who will bring a legal and practitioner's perspective as someone who actually is out there taking on cases in the international tribunals on these kinds of issues. So, Angela.
I have to agree with Alan that the data is very exciting. I find
Microphone close.
I find the quantitative data that's available to us, particularly by these two gentlemen here, to be personally fascinating, but it's also really informed some of my professional work, and it's been very important for me as an attorney, for us as a law firm, to be interacting with sociological realities, if you would, just because the law doesn't function in a vacuum. And I am going to try to tie those two things together a little bit and ask a series of questions, or point out some important questions that would inform the kind of legal norms that we would want to establish in response to the difficulties that have been raised today with regard to proselytism and where to draw lines and things like that. I was really interested that this morning we started out essentially with a theological discussion about the imperative of proselytism from within different faith traditions. It occurred to me as I was preparing for today that, in a sense, there's a sort of a moral imperative within almost any truth claim. That's something that others have said today too, and not just religious truth claims, that that if you believe in something such as the truth, or that you are right, by the nature of that belief, there is a sense that you have to share that. And as I look at different legal regimes, religion and religious expression does stand out from different types of expression, because it is so often, or much more often, accepted that that type of expression can be restricted in ways that other expression shouldn't be. And I often wonder, why that is, in the face of what I consider sort of ontological reality of who we are and how human beings are formed by nature to communicate what they believe in with one another. Because if you didn't have that communication, what you would have in the realm of conscience, or even just the way people think, are isolated pods where people are free to have their conscience but shouldn't be sharing it, and free to have thoughts but certainly aren't going to communicate those thoughts, and that would make for a very, very strange society. And yet the principles that are put forward when we talk about legal restrictions on religious freedom often make a certain separation between the public and private realms. So religious sentiments are perfectly fine, but they really belong in the home, or they really belong in your heart. And they're even fine in the public square until it interferes with, butts up against somebody else's life. And I think that there's another reality at play that's constantly informing how we think about the law, and how not only how it does look and why it looks that way in different legal systems across the world, but how it should look as we interact with it and try to, do impact litigation or change it or interact with other governments that are maybe writing constitutions and convince them, oh, this constitution looks better than the other one. And that reality is also has to do with human nature. That is, there are always going to be some people who are not only going to be offensive, but intentionally offensive, and about the very thing that others hold most dear to their hearts. So a primary question for me is in that gray area. It's very easy for us to talk about free speech and even talk about free religious expression when what's being expressed isn't particularly controversial, and when there isn't that element of enthusiasm and persuasion. But the gray area is when you have somebody who says something that is extremely disturbing to another individual or even an entire community. So it's within that framework that we're always having to think about the law. You cannot ignore those things even as you define and eventually defend certain principles that you would say should be perhaps, should cross borders and boundaries and language and politics and culture and that kind of thing. And interacting with those realities, I feel that one of the most important questions is how you want to respond to that. And I think that there are two different kinds of responses that you can have. You can have a legal response where you regulate or you restrict, or on the other hand, you actively protect, or you can have a sociological response. That is, social pressures can be brought to bear on people in order to conform their speech. If you make it extremely uncomfortable for somebody to be offensive and take away, say, his radio audience, it's much more difficult for that person to continue. But there is that tension all the time, and I see it in every country that we go to, where you have these realities at play. They are inescapable in every single culture. Even one where there's a huge religious majority, there's always that pesky little minority that's upsetting the apple cart. And how does the government respond to it? By saying this is a sociological response is the appropriate one, that we try to do things that encourage people not to pursue unwise speech, as opposed to we throw them in jail. So I thought I would both explain a little bit the state of the law just by saying, and then also look at some specific examples of some of the things we've been talking about in 3 different countries, and I will be brief about all of those. But there are already existing limitations to speech. So a lot of times what we hear is, yes, religious freedom is important, but that it shouldn't be absolute. And there's no argument about that. Not only shouldn't be absolute, but there isn't a single legal regime in the world, including in international law, that regards it as absolute. So freedoms are always balanced against one another. And there are other concerns that aren't just freedoms that mitigate different freedoms, like freedom of religion. So for example, there are exceptions or limitations that are already permitted under every international law instrument that talks about fundamental freedoms of expression and religion, that have to do with the maintenance of public order, that have to do with state security concerns. And you see those kinds of limitations reflected in pretty much every legal system that also has protections for religious freedom. So speaking of myths, it's a myth to say that there's anybody out there that advocates some sort of an absolutism when it comes to religious expression. There are limitations that are already there, and that pretty much everybody who supports religious freedom would accede to as well. And that's for a number of reasons, one of them just being the well-functioning of society. That is to say, it's a very practical thing to do. So a really easy example for an audience like this would be, America has incitement to hatred laws, or the classic thing that you hear about is, shouting fire in a crowded theater or something like that. That's not legal. You have freedom of speech, but the state has an interest both in maintaining public order and making sure that you don't cause panic for no reason and endanger the lives of others in an imminent way. So theoretically, in terms of international law, those limitations exist. Beyond that, in terms of legal structures, I'll give you 3 examples in 3 different countries of laws that essentially restrict proselytism. Maybe explain a little bit about what they've shown me. And what's funny is that you would think that I agree with Professor Woodberry that anecdotal evidence is terrible, but my anecdotal evidence is confirmed by their data. I mean, I go country to country, and you look at different legal problems and different situations, and you talk to villagers, and you talk to governors, and you kind of look at how things play out. You have X law, how does that impact the rest of society? And I come out with, I have a sense of what the playing out of the law will look like. And then I look at their broader data, and it's true across the board. It feels really good. But so one example is in India, there are a number of anti-conversion laws that are supposed to prevent forced conversion. And that sounds terrible, forced conversion. Nobody would want to see that. And in fact, the law already prohibits that kind of thing. So if you think about it, the law already has laws against, or the law already provides for criminal penalties for assault, murder, forced imprisonment, fraud, even defamation of persons, any number of things that you would use to force somebody to convert, to coerce their conscience or make it incredibly painful or difficult for them to make their own choices about which religious tradition or faith to live out or to choose. But once you look at the way the laws are written, you realize that what they're targeting is actually speech and certain types of activity that we've talked about today. So more social work. The threat of divine displeasure is an example of the kinds of forced conversion activities that are banned by some of these laws. That is to say, if you say that God would be happier if you became a Muslim instead of whatever it is you were, your Adivasi tribal faith or Hindu faith, that would be considered psychologically coerced and therefore forced coercion or forced conversion. Other things are, pecuniary benefit or material benefits are prohibited. That causes particular problems for example, Catholic missionaries that have been in some of the poorest parts of India for many hundreds of years, providing free medical care and free education. And while I have found from visiting them that they are either no longer or never have been, I wasn't there 200 years ago, particularly evangelical, they certainly are very open about their faith, and when the opportunity arises, are willing to share it. So if that's coupled with the only school that's available because the state provides no quality education, or because other religious communities provide no quality education, is that a coercion of choice? Is that a forced choice? That is, you have to subject yourself to Catholic teaching in order to get ahead, financially or economically or educationally. Another example that I'll mention is in Malaysia. The Constitution does provide for religious freedom for all people, but it also has two other very interesting provisions. That is, there's a parallel legal system of both civil and Islamic law in limited areas. So Islamic law doesn't apply to every area of life, but only if you're a Muslim and only in certain areas that have to do essentially with personal or family laws, marriage, divorce, child custody, and indeed conversion. And there's been a lot of tension with converts as a result, because the question of jurisdiction is very important when you have two legal systems operating in parallel. So every citizen has religious freedom, and every citizen is protected by the Constitution, and every citizen falls under civil law. But if you're considered a Muslim and you have a matter related to these enumerated issues, like marriage or child custody, you fall under the jurisdiction of the Sharia courts, which have never granted a statement of apostasy or recognized somebody leaving Islam. The Constitution, the second provision that's very interesting is that the Constitution defines ethnic Malays, which comprise about 60% of Malaysia and who have been traditionally Muslim by faith, as Muslims. So you're already defined as a Muslim under the law. In order to get out of the jurisdiction of Sharia law, you have to actually be recognized somehow by the civil courts as not Muslim, so that you can go under the jurisdiction of the civil courts instead of have, say, your conversion or apostasy application be judged by the Sharia courts. In this situation, proselytism has taken on it's become a very complex issue. There are a number of local laws and state-level laws in Malaysia that restrict proselytism only to Muslims. But what happens when your identity as a Muslim is defined not by your own statement of conscience, but by the state, and even in the Constitution by virtue of where you were born into or by your ethnicity? So if you're an ethnic Malay, you're defined as a Muslim, and that's essentially where you will stay, and the reality of Sharia courts never granting statements of apostasy. So there was an earlier discussion, I think, about how we even think about religious identity and what that actually means. In this particular context, because religious identity is so closely tied to ethnic identity, the question of persuasion changes quite a bit. It automatically becomes something that's communal, and communal not defined by any act of choice or conscience, but by virtue of the community that existed that you were born into. And that's a legal reality in Malaysia, but you see this in quite a few countries, in many different religious communities, where your religious identity is deeply, deeply tied to your communal identity. And the last example that I'll give is in Indonesia. It has a blasphemy law that's being litigated right now and challenged in the Supreme Court, or in the Constitutional Court. In Jakarta, I won't go into the details of the blasphemy law. It's actually quite standard, but it affects, as the professors were talking about before, it mostly actually affects minorities and dissenters within majority faiths. So the best example in Indonesia is are Ahmadiyas, who consider themselves Muslims but depart in a number of ways from what many Muslims consider traditional Muslim ideology. So they would be considered heterodox, and many Muslims would say, and this is their freedom of religion and speech as well, that Ahmadiyas shouldn't be and are not, in fact, true Muslims. But there are specific laws that are targeted at limiting not the Ahmadiyas' right to exist per se, but their ability to proselytize by sharing their faith publicly, and in particular within Muslim communities that don't consider themselves already Ahmadiyya. And in interacting with some government officials in Indonesia, one of the most interesting things was very long conversations in which the people who are defending some of these joint decrees and essentially blasphemy laws against Ahmadiyyas said, oh, but we should have the right to go and correct their theological thinking. They just shouldn't have the right to come and correct ours because it's very disturbing to Muslims. They would get very upset. And then they invoke that social order limitation that I mentioned earlier. That is, when they upset the community becomes violent, and therefore that's a legitimate limitation on their expression because it disturbs the public order. So those are three examples of how it plays out. But in almost every example, what you see is typically that the law not only its intention targets the minority population, but the effect is always to target the minority population as well. So when there was another case in Indonesia where somebody was arrested for blaspheming a Christian church, and the church's leaders went to the police and said, we don't feel blasphemed, so what are you charging him with? And the police said, don't interfere with what we're doing. We're bringing him up on these charges anyway. So you have these interesting questions of what should the role of the state be in negotiating these theological questions and determining what exactly is being violated, sensibilities, feelings, offense. Now, what we're left with at the end of the day when you see that these kinds of speech restrictive laws in enforcement are almost always, if not always, enacted largely against religious minorities or dissenters, again, within larger faiths, is, well, what actually works? I'm American and I'm kind of biased, but the American free speech model, which is very, very broad, is an island in the world, and that's something that's quite important for us to recognize. That is, we have the broadest free speech laws in the world. We allowed the Nazis to march through Skokie, and it was declared a fundamental constitutional right for them to do so in a period of time when it would have been unheard of, I think, under European laws, or in Germany, for example, post-war. But we are an island, so it brings to the fore the question of how do you interact with other societies where the communal identity and the communal values are really so different from some of what we know. At what point does cultural sensitivity, is that supposed to translate into a different way to talk about principles and universal human rights? So there are some societies, and in fact much of the world, where identity is very communal and entirely dependent, frankly, on your relationship with others. Your worth, your sense of self, your social standing is very much dependent on your marital status, on how many children you have, on what they do, on your relationships within the community and your standing there. And I'm not exactly sure how you interact with that, but I do keep falling back on something that is at the core of religious freedom, that is what informs our belief that there are such a thing as rights to speech, to persuasion, or to exist, or to have a conscience and exercise it in some sort of a social way. And that is the most convincing root of those rights is in the inherent dignity of the human person. And I do have to wonder, as we think about who human beings are and what those ontological realities are, that is, what about us can we not escape? We have to keep coming back to that point and say, does that apply to a person even living in a society where the communal identity is so important, in a place where people may not ascribe value to other based simply on who they are in themselves as opposed to who they are in relationship to others. So I kind of leave that question as the one question that's come up for me over and over again, even today. That is, I think it was Salam from Impact earlier who mentioned different types of incredibly offensive speech and what you do with that kind of intentionally offensive speech. And the question of where you draw these lines and what the results are once you draw them, I think are very important. But we can't escape the foundational question of who we are and whether we want to bury our heads in the sand and legislate according to the world we'd like to see, or whether we want to legislate according to the world we have and who people actually are. And part of that is that they will be offensive, and also that people will prefer the tyranny of the majority and to hang on to their power and therefore exercise it against minorities. And the fundamental question there for a lawyer, and I'll conclude with this, is do you want the law to predominantly to protect minorities and dissenters, or do you want them predominantly to protect the majority culture or society of the day, which will change over time?
Wow, thank you, Angela. Isn't it? It's fascinating to me that our last presentation by a lawyer dealt with a question, the ontological question of who we are as human beings, which I actually think does go to the heart of the issue of religious freedom. Well, we're going to open it up for questions. Please, we have the microphones. Please tell us who you are and direct your question.
Hi, my name is Al Gombas. I'm from the State Department. My question's for Angela. I'm going to ask this in a rather pointed way intentionally. Where does the right not to be offended come from, and what are the implications of that source?
Well, I don't think there is that right, and that's one of the most contentious issues in religious freedom today. The idea of the right not to be offended is behind or is used as a justification for many existing blasphemy laws, and is certainly used as a justification for what is essentially international law that's being pushed at the United Nations against defamation of religion. And I put that in quotes because defamation traditionally applies to falsehoods about individuals, which a court can verify as a matter of fact or factual inquiry, as opposed to defamation of ideas or religions. I mean, in order to determine whether or not you've defamed a religion, you have to first decide what the truth about the religion is in order to decide that what was said about the religion was defamatory, i.e. untrue. That puts the state in a very odd position. So that right doesn't exist, the right not to be offended. That said, I think it's a huge mistake for lawyers and others not to, again, recognize the sociological reality of what happens when you intentionally provoke offense. That is to say, when you intentionally do things in order to be provocative and offensive and to insult others. The American way has always been to say that that's free speech. And in many ways, that's the cost of an open society, because governments, which have the power, essentially, which have police power, right, have always and throughout time been terrible adjudicators of what kind of speech should be allowed. Anything that offends the power structure typically is what gets struck down. So I'm bringing it back to what the effect of a particular rule is, even if you think that rule will keep people from behaving better. And the effect, I think, it's shown in the data here, not just in my anecdotal feelings or observations, is that it's very rare that the minority or the dissenter isn't being targeted. One data point that didn't come out, and I'm curious whether you've done a lot of study of this, is I have sort of long said that blasphemy laws in Muslim countries are actually, I mean, they disproportionately affect religious minorities, but they're enacted statistically much more often against Muslims themselves, actually. So I've seen some data from Pakistan and a study of how blasphemy cases are brought that echo that. But I am interested in what kinds of studies have been done in other countries that have similar anti-speech laws as well.
And you want to take that on?
I don't know in terms of statistically on that. I haven't studied that. What I would say is missionaries who make offensive statements, it's not a very effective missionary technique. So there's a regulating effect of it. I'd also say in terms of laws, it should be something that people would be willing to apply to themselves. So often people who are very offended by something else, someone else says about their group, often say offensive things about other groups, and don't want those offensive statements said in other countries, etc. For example, Denmark and the cartoons, or things like that. And so we shouldn't apply standards to other religious groups that we're not willing to apply to ourselves. And I think it's very important for people to collect data and say, okay, is that a standard you apply to a state? Okay, which country that predominantly your tradition has rules where they do this better than that place, for example? Because I think otherwise it becomes like we're, the US or something is imposing this external standard. But most of these things are things that people don't want done to themselves. And make that claim of others, but then just don't apply the same standard to themselves. So there has to be sort of the hypocrisy test that's applied.
Okay, over here in the back.
Paul Heck from the theology department here at Georgetown. I just wanted to direct a question to Angela and maybe others as well. We've been talking today, and I missed the second panel, so it might have been addressed, but we've been talking about political and religious liberties, but there's often the question of moral liberties that come with that, and that's often where people can get concerned. The past year I was teaching a course on the history of religion in America, in Morocco, to an entirely Muslim audience, and we dealt with the First Amendment and all sorts of things throughout the course of our history here in this country in terms of religion and religious freedom. And they said, well, okay, today you're talking about religious freedom and you want us to consider religious freedom. I know there's some people at the embassy who encourage them to think about that. But they said, and tomorrow you're going to ask us for, making constitutional liberties for people who want abortions and gay marriage, right? And so, okay, whatever one thinks about those issues, in their minds, they come together. The moral liberties come with the religious liberties and the political liberties. And so it's more than just a question of communal identity being preserved, but there are some real questions of what is moral truth, what's the ontological character of the human being, and this is where I find it really difficult, because moral liberties do seem to be kind of quickly following behind the others. And so I don't know whether you could address that, if you've thought about that, or if you know literature that you could suggest to me to help me think more about that, or the others. So thank you.
I think actually both professors would have something to say about that as well. But I'll bring up just a quick example from recent experience. Well, first, religious freedom can't be divorced from those other questions, and I think it's great that your students are bringing those questions up. And frankly, I wish more Americans were willing to have those discussions as well. Sort of what are the costs of our freedoms? What does it really mean? But in this Indonesian blasphemy case that's at the Constitutional Court, one of the arguments that's been brought up by the side that's defending the blasphemy laws has been that the cost of religious freedom will be more abortions and sexual license. And and that religion would no longer exist in the public square. That is, if you look at countries with religious freedom, you'll see that religion can't be taught in public schools in America. You'll see moral degradation, all of this kind of thing. And that is fascinating to me as an argument that's coming up in a Jakarta court case. But we were asked, well, is this true? By some of the lawyers that are watching this case in Indonesia. And it's really interesting because it's not true that religion isn't a part of public life in America or can't be taught in public schools. It most certainly can be taught as a neutral academic subject. It can't be forced on students, or truth claims can't be forced on students, but the explanation of the truth claims of each religious faith can be taught and examined. The question of moral license, you're almost asking the wrong person, because I'm a little bit of a libertarian. So I'm very morally conservative, and I believe in this sort of self-regulation. And in fact, I think it's a very good thing that religious communities have laws that they exercise on themselves, and even internal tribunals, that the civil law and that the police power cannot be used to enforce. But I'm a big believer in conservative moral values. That doesn't mean that I want to see the state, which again, is not the same thing as a religious community or as any standalone community, but has a lot of baggage. That is to say, they have a self-interest in self-preservation. They have an interest, any institution, right? But then they also have guns at the consent of the people, that's the institution that needs to be distinguished maybe from other institutions. And that's where I would sort of challenge people to think, the universe that you want to see, how do you want to see it come about? And back to the question of human nature, what works? We can talk later about Morocco, which is fascinating.
I would also say that it's an important reason why the argument for religious liberty shouldn't be made primarily with secular arguments. Because it's often framed, I think incorrectly, that religious liberty is the result of religious weakness. So you had this conflict and then people left religion, and then you get religious liberty. And I would argue get religious liberty through conversion attempts. I mean, by people, the people who advocate religious liberty are religious minorities that were persecuted by other people and then came to the States and then made Rhode Island and Delaware and Pennsylvania and stuff like that, and instantiated religious liberty even when they could have imposed their own state religion, because they said state-imposed religion doesn't save you. You see, it was out of religious conviction, not out of, religion got wiped out from the public square. So I think it's important to make religious arguments for the importance of religious liberty, not just, and also have a more historical idea about how religious liberty actually developed. And I would say in terms of religious arguments, some of them are practical. In terms of long-term, the United States has much higher religiosity than Europe, where we didn't have religious regulation, where you had religious regulation and religious subsidy to protect the church, it weakened it in the long term. When people have to compete, it forces one religious tradition to be responsive to ordinary people, i.e. and then creating greater religiosity, but also for the people to be educated about their faith and actually know what they believe rather than just be, well, we don't, I'm from this culture, so I'm this, and know nothing about what their faith believes in terms of applying it to their life. Two, I also think it's very important to make theological arguments. So, does state-imposed religion have any religious benefit? Does it please God to let you into heaven if you are this thing just because you're forced to? Does it help you move on in terms of the cycle of your lives to go to have a better rebirth if you were forced to do something? I don't think so, but do you mean that's a theological argument? Okay, is God pleased if I just this because I have to? If not, why force people?
Yeah, just one quick thing, and I feel it's a little bit dangerous to talk about the law when you have a lawyer sitting next to you, but I'd like to say also when they compare to the American model, one thing to remember is there's always that balancing act between the freedom side of the clause and the establishment side. And so one is controlling how much religion is going to be in the public arena. And how much is there a possibility of having an established religion in this, with the state? And the second one is the ones protecting individual religious freedom, the rights as far as to be able to speak, to profess, to believe the way you want to believe. I think those two are in tension. On the freedom side, I think that does not, their question on morality. I doubt that that's going to have a tremendous impact as far as on morality, except as Bob mentioned, to the extent you have higher levels of religious involvement due to freedoms, you would expect to have some, different standards of morality. Whether it's better or worse, it'd be different standards of morality. I think the other side of the clause would be the area that they should have more wonders about or be more curious about is how does it affect religion in the public arena? One is you would not have an established religion, but would it also have other negative consequences on the ability for religion to speak out in the public arena? And I think that might be the one that could have more of an impact on the concerns they were raising.
And I might add, what this suggests is we have to be clear about what religious freedom means here expansively in order to defend it abroad. Because if the Establishment Clause means we have to privatize religion here, that's not going to be very appealing around the world.
And one other thing I'd say, too, is that one thing to recall as far as with the law, too, is that even with the most liberal interpretations of religious freedom in the United States, and I think Angela's absolutely right as far as what she was saying as far as the U.S. being very distinctive in that regard, even there, we've always had the compelling interest clause. Does the state have compelling interest to intervene? In the Amish case, it was said it did not have compelling interest as far as to send them to school longer. So it's not that it gives a license to do anything. It's a matter of as far as that we cannot deny that freedom unless there's truly a compelling case to intervene.
Yes, question in the front here. Front here? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, here you are. Okay. And then we'll go
I'd like to just go a little further with this, because one of the things that I have found most fascinating is I've talked to people around the world about religious freedom. First of all, they are pleased, shocked but pleased, to discover that there are many Americans who are as shocked by the level of amorality in parts of the American public square as they are. That we're just as profoundly unhappy with it as they are. And secondly, they do see the American model coming with the pornography and the laissez-faire attitude about sex and all the other things that seem to dominate in areas of our public square. I've actually had in Cuba, for instance, I've had Baptists who are really sharp leaders who are very reticent to be happy about any coming freedom, because they know what comes with it. The Baptists are flourishing in Cuba in spite of intermittent persecution, and they are very concerned about what will happen if the libertine to the north is freed to come in 90 miles away and just inundate them with what they see as the accompaniment of liberty. They see liberty and libertinism as the equivalent. So how do we address that? Because it's a real issue. I've heard it from more traditional societies across the globe.
Wow, what a powerful question. Who wants to take that one on?
I don't know. I mean, all I can say is I can offer an example of someone who was doing missionary work doing field study in Ukraine, and offered a similar example where they had missionaries coming over from the United States, and the pastor said, they want to come and speak and give their testimony to the congregation tonight. And he says, how are they dressed? And so they described how they were dressed as, no, I don't think so, because they were dressed like the Americans, and it thought it would represent them poorly morally. So I think there's clearly is that concern around there. As far as, I'm not sure how it,
I mean, how do you make the case that this will not be the inevitable result? I mean, I've heard this from Catholics in Poland. I've heard it from Orthodox in Russia and in the Ukraine. I've heard it from Muslims both in the Arab world and the non-Arab world, and I've heard it from Baptists in Cuba.
Yeah. I'm not sure you can guarantee that it won't, but I'm not sure that it's totally attributed to religious freedoms as much as freedoms more in general.
Right.
And I think that when things open up, as freedoms in all avenues of life, then it opens up all these other avenues beyond religion too.
Right.
So I'm not sure it's the freedom of religion to fear as much as freedom in all other areas, that they will be exposed to a whole lot more. Even if you go back and you look at Portugal and Spain, they changed much more slowly after Vatican II. And so as a result, you see the number of priests and religious being about the same as it was before Vatican II, but then as soon as they opened up more, then the reforms of Vatican II came in and they saw more drops. So I think you see it in a lot of places, but I don't think it's simply due to the religious freedoms per se.
I don't either, but
Yeah.
they see the equation that they're making
Sure.
Right.
is that one inevitably leads to the other.
Right.
Yeah.
And I hope that's not true.
Tom, we have another
If
question
I
in front
could
here.
just
Go ahead.
briefly try to respond to
Yeah.
Richard's excellent question. It seems to me, somebody was talking about in an earlier panel of the importance of the judiciary. It seems to me religious freedom means the right of religious actors to argue in the public square for restrictions on the kinds of license that you're talking about. But if there is a judiciary which sweeps aside by establishing a right to one or another kind of behavior, then that is a restriction on religious freedom in my view. So part of the answer is true democracy with respect to a balance of religious and secular views, arguing, competing on behalf of their views of the public good and the common good. So it's all the fault of the Supreme Court is the answer.
There's a question right up in front here. We'll take one more question.
Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, Georgetown University. I have a question from the Department of Anthropology. I have a question for Robert, and this is not anecdotal. I want to push you a little bit more on the significance of missionary activity in fomenting in positive things like mass literacy and increased services for the poor. And an alternative theory, and I'm sure you've considered many of them, is that nationalism movements did this, Benedict Anderson, Ernest Gellner, all sorts of other theories of modernization would not necessarily credit the missionization quite the way you are. So I'm asking you to kind of elaborate a little bit more on your data.
Sure. A lot of that, I think, has to do with the backgrounds of the people writing. So then they just whitewash the missions out of the history and out of the analysis. Virtually all of the first wave of nationalists around the world graduated from Protestant mission schools. Some of them hated missionaries, but most, also some Catholic schools too, but most African nationalists graduated from mission schools. Most Arab nationalists also graduated from mission schools. Many of them were Christian Arabs. You have similar thing in terms of Korea. So there's like this Declaration of Independence when the Japanese came in. There's all these other things. There's this huge, huge connection between graduates of mission schools and the first wave of nationalism, even if some of them did not like missionaries. Same thing with printing. Benedict Anderson puts the emphasis on printing. If it's really printing that caused it, we would have had modern nationalism in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam well before the 19th century. We didn't. They had printing 800 years before Europe. They had movable font 80 years before Europe. You get these movements in the 19th century in reaction to some of the things that are introduced through this missionary stuff in terms of mass printing, mass vernacular printing, integrating everyone, not just the elite in terms of reading, some of the ideas about self-determination that were taught in the mission schools, et cetera, which are connected to this. Now, people didn't always apply those. I mean, so there's lots of, missionaries are shaped by their culture, and they are involved with racism and other things like that, just like their culture was at the time. But, do you mean, they've just excised where the printing came from and where the education came from, for et cetera, from their histories, because it doesn't fit into their theory. But it's there.
One more question, back here.
Dave Buckley, I'm a PhD student in the government department here. A question primarily for Professor Finke, I guess, although anyone else would be more than interested to hear your thoughts. So you talked about the, and you've written about the correlation between religious freedom and any number of other liberal and democratic features of societies. I'm curious if you've done any work or know of any work on how societies that have changed recently, if they also fit that pattern. Because what I'm thinking of here is what we've learned about sort of the democratic peace recently, which is democracies don't fight each other. Okay, but actually that was being driven by a set of democracies to be democratized early. It turns out newer democracies, right after they democratize, do fight each other, and new democracy increases conflict. It doesn't lead to social harmony and the other things that you've talked about. And I'm wondering if changes to existing religion state regulations, particularly changes that encourage pluralism, would have these sort of short-term hazards, even with long-term benefits. If there's any work out there on that.
Yeah, and I think probably the greatest risk there would be in countries, you know, as Angela was illustrating with India, for example, tremendous amount of social pressure, social movements, political parties are organized around those movements. So I think that would probably increase the possibility of that occurring. I would say there would be, so on the one hand, no, we haven't taken, you know, a handful of them and really looked at them individually. So that I don't have good examples of. A couple things I could offer, though, would be in the forthcoming book with Cambridge, we do offer, like, say, case studies of Japan, for example, when it went, you know, and then gave some examples of minority religions which cause things that would be potentially politically sensitive, and how they were dealt with when there was less regulation involved than there would have been historically. So we have a few historical examples in our case studies where we try to illustrate that. The other work that might be somewhat related to that, although not perfectly, would be, I think, in Tony Gill's work, where he looks at the relationship between church and state. And in some of that, you get to see, he talks about a few different transitions, case studies. You get to see how, as the relationship between church and state changes, you know, how the potential tensions between religions change and how that's played out. But I think it's a very good question, because once you have a society set up where you have social movements, political parties, or others that are organized around religion, and there's very real tensions there, does just fully deregulating it at that point, would that be one situation potentially dangerous? And, potentially it would, but I think at the same time, it's the very thing you see. Why do we have fewer Catholic organizations than we once did in this country? In part, they mobilized because they were a minority group, and they had to mobilize often against the majority Protestant. Now, once that need is no longer there to mobilize against the majority Protestant, those groups in part die out. The religion is still very much there, but in terms of some of those movements, some of the, they used to say, first they leave the party, then they leave the faith, with Catholics. Well, now some of them are leaving the party, and they're still in the faith. It's remarkable. So, but that seemed impossible before. So I don't have some good examples, but I think it'd be a very interesting thing to look at.
Does anyone have oh, go ahead.
Okay, I would say anytime you challenge an existing power structure, there's likely to be some kind of response, and some of it violent.
Unless, if I may,
Go ahead.
Unless the law and the judiciary and the other law enforcement wings of government are set against encouraging a culture of impunity.
Right,
That's been one of the major, one of the major problems in religious freedom just comes down to impunity. So you have these 83% of countries that have perfectly good laws on the books, but the way they're enforced or not enforced regularly is prejudiced in a very specific way. And it's through impunity. It's not necessarily just the government exercising specific and active persecution. It's the government and the local police turning a blind eye when you have a majority reacting violently against some sort of disturbance from a minority.
Yeah, to return to that one example I gave in my talk, was if you take the similar thing as far as with civil rights, and you look as far as the number of lynchings and other things which occurred in civil rights, at times there was sometimes a slight increase when freedoms first came about. But once as far as the freedoms were truly in place, then they dropped dramatically, And so it could be that when things are in transition, when things aren't in place, where the judiciary is still not completely on your side, or you don't have the laws, then perhaps there would be a slight increase. But again, it's a very interesting question.
Well, I think the time is at hand, and I want to congratulate the Berkeley Center again on a tremendous and trenchant symposium, and I'm sure our panelists will be available for some final questions. Thank you very much.